Hi, and welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice, and my guest today is Jack Whyte. He's the author of 6 very popular novels that take us back to the time of King Arthur and a little bit before. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tell me first, where's your strongest passion? Is it for the fact or for the fiction?
Nobody's ever asked me that before. I think it's for the fact. If the fact didn't exist, then the fiction couldn't function. That sounds very arcane.
So you got to have it
true.
started rooted somewhere in reality.
Yes, and I've always been fascinated by the reality of that period and by what was happening in Britain. I think it's one of the most viscerally exciting and important periods in British history.
You'll probably have to give us a bit of a history lesson. Rome occupied England for 460 years, if I have it right, and then it ended. What happened next?
Well, that's the whole point. When in school, when I was a kid, I can still see it. The history book that we used stated quite bluntly, the Romans left Britain in 401 AD. Well, they had been there, as you say, for over 400 years. That's as silly and inane as someone saying today, the English-speaking peoples will leave North America in 2011.
Yes.
It's not going to happen. You can't just uproot 400 years of history and infrastructure overnight. So what actually happened in Britain was that the armies, the Roman armies left, and they had been the stiffening backbone of Britain for centuries, absolute centuries. Even if you look at the first 100 years as being a period of conquest, and it was by no means all that long, a period of unrest. Then there were 300 years after that when everything was hunky-dory and everybody settled down to make the best of the situation. And during that 300-year period, the huge Roman farms that were known as latifundia, the big ranches, were put in place and they thrived so that Britain, South Britain, became pretty effectively one of the breadbaskets of the Western Roman Empire. And the Pax Romana, the peace of the Roman Empire, made sure that everything flowed as it ought to for the economy. Very little difference between the Roman economy and the North American economy in terms of shareholders and profits and all the motives to get things going. Mm-hmm. They say there's nothing new under the sun, and when you start looking at the way the Roman Empire functioned, there really is nothing new under the sun.
But of course, after they pulled out, I would assume there's going to be all kinds of power struggles happening.
Yes, because the moment you take the army away, you take away the enforcing power of the state, then the law immediately is a casualty. Because if you do something wrong and I say to you on behalf of myself and the people in the community, we are going to put you in jail, your next response is, oh yeah, you and whose army? The army's gone. Nobody can do it. And so you had all these power struggles among ambitious local leaders, each of whom was trying to consolidate his own position and expand it. And so you had the very rapid growth of a warlord society.
Yes.
And the person who unified all these warlords and thus became effectively the first High King of Britain is the man that we today call King Arthur. Now he's encrusted with legend today. But I went looking for the original Arthur. If he lived, who must he have been? Who could he have been? Because he comes with his own set of built-in criteria. Am I talking too much?
No, that's fine. Before we got settled into King Arthur there, I was wondering about these battles. I mean, whenever I travel to England or Scotland, and I start digging into the history again, I'm kind of appalled at the level of violence that's there. This was a time of
and
this is coming from an American, one of the most violent societies in the
totally
history.
Appreciative of that, yeah.
But what kind of warfare was going on? I mean, we see things in the movies and that sort of stuff, but does that come close to the fact, men out there with very large swords driving them through each other's bodies?
Oh, of course it does, yeah. I mean, the biggest difficulty we have in looking at these things, including Braveheart, which is a case in point, and Gladiator, we look at them today with outraged 20th century and 21st century sensibilities, and we say, oh my God, these people were so violent. Well, of course they were. They didn't have the legion of the politically correct sitting there saying, tut, tut, you can't do that. Yeah. Yes, they used weapons. The only reason they were so violent with the huge swords and the maces and the clubs that they had. The sole reason that they were so involved with those things was because they didn't have machine guns. So if you wanted to expand your territories, the only way you could do it was the same way that the American settlers did in the West. There are people living there already, tough. They're subhuman because they can't possibly be as good as us, so we'll just push them out.
Yeah.
It's never changed. It hasn't changed today. It's happening in Africa. It's happening in Serbia.
Just different weapons.
Different, more sophisticated weapons. And I mean, one ricocheting shell, I understand, inside the steel hull of a tank has the effect of a blender once it's pierced the armor. Now, how can that possibly be as eye-raisingly, how can we accept that and still turn up our noses at the way the 11th century Scots behaved?
Point taken. Let's go to your book, Uther, the new book in the series here. What year would this be?
Uther, it would be the year 411 AD, the turn of the 5th century. The Romans left in the first decade, effectively, of the century. And Uther was born in, according to my reconstruction, in 401, in the year the Romans effectively left Britain, the first of them.
And he's the father of the future King Arthur.
He is the father of the boy who will be king, yes.
What got you interested in jumping back to that generation rather than staying at the Arthurian time?
Because, in the first place, I was never really interested in writing about the Arthurian legend. Everybody has written the Arthurian legend. Everybody knows. Arthur married Guinevere, met Lancelot, and the whole thing fell apart. My motivation was to put together all of the root elements that came together, that converged to make it possible for an Arthur character to emerge. And so I went back before him, and I thought, okay, if I know the ending, which is how the sword came out of the stone, and that's what started me writing the book. I knew how it was done for the first time in 1,500 years without having to say it's magic. I knew how
was
it was
done?
You got to read the book. Come on, you know better than
here.
that.
No secrets revealed.
But I went in with that in mind, knowing the ending of the story. Then my task was to find the beginning. Now, that was back in 1977.
So you've gone back.
I went backwards. And had anyone told me it was going to take me 5 great big fat novels to reach that end scene, I probably would never have started. But ignorance is bliss. I went in not knowing what I was getting involved in.
Uther is torn between what forces in his world?
Uther is torn between the forces, I was going to say right, left, good, evil, black, white, day, night. There were 2 coexisting societies in Britain. A lot of people don't realize this. A symbiotic relationship between the Romans, whom we nowadays like to call the Romano-British, and the Celts, the local clansmen. Yes. They never intermingled. The Celts back then, I have every reason to believe, were exactly the same as the Celts today. You come over from America and you move into a little village in Scotland or Wales or Ireland and you live there for 65 years. When you die, everybody will be very sad to see you go, but you were only a visitor.
Yes.
Right? Whereas they've been there for countless generations. That has not changed. Also, there's something in the nature of the Celt that allows them to embrace religions like Calvinism. It's almost a tunnel vision, and yet it is not, because within their own society they can be extremely magnanimous. But there's an anti-syzygy there. There's a contradiction in terms in the Celtic nature. Arrogant humility is the best way I can express it. They are humble, genuinely. It's not hypocritical, and yet they have this monumental arrogance in considering that they are the people, and everyone else is, by definition, slightly inferior.
Yes. Religiously, are they embracing both Christianity and pagan things together?
In those days, yes. The entire,
together?
not only Britain, but the entire western part of Europe was doing that. We know that St. Patrick was active in Ireland around the turn of the 5th century. And we hear stories about his conversion of the Irish to Christianity. We have no idea how all-embracing that conversion was, because any conversion there was a huge step forward in terms of Christian versus pagan. And it's always the literate people who write the history. And the Christians were the dominant literary agency at that time in Britain. England, we know, England, or Britain as it was called in those days, was very strongly into pantheism.
Nature worship.
All kinds of worship. They had their own theology, they had their own hierarchy of gods, and they also embraced some of the Roman gods. And the Romans themselves were very, very newly converted to Christianity. It was only in the 4th century that Constantine the Great had recognized Christianity. And when he did so, he did not recognize Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire. He recognized it as an official religion of the Roman Empire. But he himself wanted to become involved in it. He wanted to be a cardinal. And it was Constantine and his immediate successors who removed Christianity from the realm of the homespun dressed peasant and put them in the Palace of the Vatican and created all these trappings of empire around them. Because if the emperor was going to be a Christian, then he wanted to dress like the emperor, and he wanted all his Christian friends to be well dressed too.
What about this other thing that's going on at the same time? Sorcery, another mystical area here. You have Merlin is Uther's cousin, I believe, in your book. What's a sorcerer do for a living? What's his day job?
Well, exactly what I've written about. It's, he is not a sorcerer. You see, sorcery, Merlin the magician is a modern concept. Again, it's only come out in the last few hundred years that Merlin was a magician. Power is knowledge, magic is power. Merlin, the way I visualize him, is not a sorcerer figure. He doesn't walk around wearing long robes and carrying a magic wand. At least he doesn't start wearing the long robes until he's much, much older. In the beginning, he's a very well-educated young man in a time when literacy was dying out rapidly. People did not read, and the Romans had gone. They'd taken their libraries with them. They had taken their clerks with them. They had taken their regimental quartermasters with them. They had taken record keeping with them. And the people left in Britain very quickly lost any connection they had with literacy. Uther, or Merlin rather, had the advantage of growing up in a Roman-based community in Camelot and having been educated in the Roman way. He knew how to read and write, and he also, by my invention, had one foot squarely in the roots of the Celtic side of his family and was influenced by the Druids and had the Druidic teaching there. So he was able to combine these two cultures within his own mind and present his knowledge.
And he would be lecturing to people and...
Not lecturing, just
Just
impressing people by how much he knows. Same way as you'll meet somebody today in a bar somewhere and get talking to them, and the power of his insight and his mind and his articulate ability to express himself will impress the blazes out of you.
So the magic is more some kind of an invention that happens centuries afterwards.
Yes, it's the impression that he made on people. And having a sense of humor, he's got his tongue in his cheek as much as anyone around today. He sees the impression he makes on people. He enjoys it. He's enough of a quirky intellect to get a charge out of it. And so he encourages people to think he's different because he needs them to think he's different.
Okay, we're going to take a very short break right now, and we'll be back with our guest Jack Whyte right after this. Welcome back to Off the Page. My guest today is Jack Whyte. Jack, tell us a little bit about yourself. I can tell by that accent that you didn't grow up in the neighborhood. Where are you from?
I was born in Scotland, and I grew up there until I was old enough to be trusted out on my own, and then I was sent to England for the rest of my education, which was an experience. And So I came to Canada when I was 27, and by that time I was a teacher of high school English.
How'd you like teaching high school English in Canada?
I loved it.
Did you?
I loved it. I even taught it in England. People used to look at me and say, "That's a Jock accent. You know, you're a Scotsman. How can you teach English in England?" My response was always, "Well, somebody's got to teach you people how to talk." But I came out here as a teacher of English and French.
But then you kind of moved on. You got into advertising and things like that.
What happened was that I discovered I could make a lot more money singing songs in pubs.
Oh yeah.
And so I became a professional musician, entertainer, folk singer. And from that, I moved on and I did a whole lot. Everything I've done, though, I've changed careers umpteen times in the last 30 years. But everything that I did, whether it be teaching school or entertaining or being in the advertising business, a creative director or head writer, and then moving on to the client side and doing corporate communications, everything has been storytelling. No matter what I've been doing, I've been telling stories.
Yeah.
So it's a fairly natural progression, even though it may confound the eye of the casual beholder. So.
And you created this one-man show of Robbie Burns. I want you to introduce us to Robbie Burns, if you will. Some of us know about him. Some of us have probably forgotten. He was an Irish. He was a Scottish
I beg your
poet.
pardon.
Yes, I bet you do. Son of a poor farmer. Take it away.
Yeah, he was the Scottish poet. And in fact, people know very little about him. He was an amazing man. And I spent a lot of time studying him because I'd loved him from my school days, and I was appalled at the way in which contemporary Scots were ignorant of him. And the language in which he wrote and performed, spoke, is no longer in existence. It's now a local dialect.
We wouldn't recognize
no,
it
you would
today
not
if
recognize
Robbie Burns was here reading to us.
He was extremely literate and extremely articulate, so he would speak English,
Yes.
but you wouldn't understand his local tongue, which is Scots.
Can you give us a little taste of what that might sound like?
Yes, there's the opening of his most famous poem, Tam O'Shanter, or his most famous song. Let's go to that one. His most famous song is "A Man's a Man for All That," and the opening lines make absolutely no sense to us today. "Is there for honest poverty that hangs his head and all that? The coward slave we pass him by, we dor be poor for all that." Now, that doesn't mean anything, but "is there" involves the sort of occlusion of part of the sentence. What he's actually saying, and what this language is implying, is there among us any man who hangs his head in shame because he's poor? If there were such a character, we'd call him a coward slave, and we would pass him by because we dare be poor. For all that and all that, our toils obscure and all that, the rank is but the guinea's stamp. The man's the gold for all that. You see yon birkie called a lord who struts and stares and all that, hundreds will worship at his word. He's just a coof for all that and all that, his tinsel show and all that. The honest man, though e'er so poor, is the king of men for all that. That's the poem that made him famous.
Yes.
And because the end of it, he says, "So let us pray that come it may, as come it will for all that sense and worth o'er all this earth will win the day and all that. For all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for all that." Now, he wrote that 100 years before Karl Marx was born.
And he was a singer.
He was not a singer, no, he was a poet. But he had this remarkable ability to hear ancient tunes, old tunes, and carry them in his head.
Right.
And he used to pick them out on a one-string fiddle. And then he would shape and sometimes polish the words that he got with the song.
And he wrote about the common man. He was more interested in the common man than
Yes, he was. He
than
wrote
the
his
elite.
poetry to be heard rather than read, because most of his contemporaries, most of his friends, the people for whom he wrote, were illiterate.
Was he political?
Extremely. Yeah.
Radical even?
Revolutionary. yes.
In what way? What was he in favor of?
Well, he lived in the time of the, the French Revolution had just happened, and the American Revolution, and he was born into a time when, at the beginning of his century, the 18th century, if, a nobleman could beat the living daylights out of you if you failed to pull your forelock to him.
Yes.
By the end of that period, Burns was saying things like, here's freedom to them that would read, and here's freedom to them that would write, for there's none ever feared that the truth should be heard, except them that the truth would indict. He said, he had so many of them, so many of them. He just embodied this emerging spirit of independence in Scotland, right. And he embodied it very, very strongly.
He died poor, though, did he?
Oh, yes, he lived and died very poor. And he died very young. He was 37 when he died.
That's a young man.
Yeah, and the biggest calumny aimed at him is that he was a lecher and a drunkard.
I've heard the story that the man drank.
It's not true.
Not true?
Absolutely not true. He had elements of both, but he actually died of endocarditis, which is an inflammation of the lining of the heart. And one of the side symptoms of it is that he would have been incapable of drinking vast amounts of hard liquor because it would have been physically painful and debilitating to him. But he lived in a time when everybody drank, and so he loved to, he wrote a great fight, He talked about his own excesses, but it was just wishful thinking. And as far as his exploits with the ladies goes, he really wasn't that much different to anybody else. But he immortalized all these women. He wrote these magnificent songs about them, which have survived. And so he drew attention to his own foibles that way.
If you could meet him on the street today, what would you say to him?
Love your poetry.
He was a satirist too, right? Created good satire.
Yes, extremely. When his treatment of this whole thing about hypocrisy, he was utterly ruthless against hypocrites. Oh, you who are so good yourself, so pious and so holy, you've naught to do but mark and tell your neighbour's faults and follies. He was very, very keen sense of humour. One fellow who died in the local town was notorious for his womanizing. And of course nobody talked about it because it wasn't really proper. And Burns wrote an epitaph for him, and it said, lament him, Mauchline husbands all, he often did assist you, for had you stayed whole weeks awo, your wives would never have missed you. And you Mauchline bairns, as on you go to school in droves together, tread you but lightly on his grave, he might have been your father.
And with that, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with Jack Whyte right after this. You've been watching Off the Page today. My guest has been Jack Whyte. If you could travel back in time, would you do it? Would you go back to the time of King Arthur or Robbie Burns' day?
I don't think so. I think we're much more comfortable sitting here looking back and yearning for it. To actually be there, I think I'd have second thoughts about being that precipitate.
I think I'm with you with that. I'm there with you on that one, Jack. Thanks for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.